I've been obsessed with vampire films since I was a kid. We're talking staying up past midnight with the blanket pulled over my head, convincing myself every shadow in my bedroom was something ancient and hungry. And honestly, that obsession never left. Today we are counting down the 20 best vampire movies ever made, and I promise you, this list is going to surprise you, challenge you, and maybe, just maybe, leave you sleeping with the lights on. Daybreakers, 2009. Kicking off our list at number 20 is a film that I personally think is one of the most underrated entries in the entire vampire genre. Daybreakers, directed by Michael and Peter Spierig, takes a concept so bold and so clever that I'm genuinely surprised the more people don't talk about it. Imagine a world where vampires have won. Not just won, but completely taken over. It is the year 2019, and nearly the entire human population has been turned. Vampires now run corporations, drive cars, drink their morning coffee with a shot of blood, and go about their routine existence with the same dull comfort of any modern society. The problem? Humans are running out. Edward Dalton, played with quiet intensity by Ethan Hawke, is a vampire hematologist racing to develop a blood substitute before civilization collapses entirely. What makes Daybreakers extraordinary is its commitment to world building. This is not a horror film that relies on jump scares or gothic atmosphere. It is a science fiction thriller with real teeth, one that uses the vampire mythology as a lens to examine capitalism, resource depletion, and the ethics of survival. Willem Dafoe shows up in a role that is equal parts cool and charismatic, and the film's final act delivers one of the most wildly satisfying payoffs of any vampire movie on this list. If you have not seen it, fix that immediately. Vampyr, 1932. At number 19, we travel back to the earliest days of sound cinema for one of the most genuinely unsettling films ever made. Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampyr is not a vampire movie in the way you might expect. There are no capes, no fangs on full display, no dramatic declarations in the night. Instead, Dreyer crafts something far more disturbing, a waking nightmare, a dreamlike descent into a world where the boundary between the living and the dead has simply dissolved. The film follows Alan Gray, a wanderer who arrives at a remote inn and finds himself drawn into a mystery involving a village terrorized by a vampiric force. Shot with experimental camera techniques, deliberate pacing, and an atmosphere so thick with dread you could cut it with a knife, Vampyr feels less like a story being told to you and more like a dream you cannot shake after waking. Dreyer shot much of the film in soft, hazy lighting that makes every frame look like a faded photograph of something that should not exist. There is a sequence in this film involving a man dreaming of his own burial that is, to this day, one of the most hauntingly original images in all of cinema history. Vampyr is slow, strange, and absolutely essential viewing for anyone who wants to understand where this genre truly came from. Shadow of the Vampire, 2000 number 18, is a film that is both a love letter to cinema history and a genuinely creepy psychological horror experience. Shadow of the Vampire, directed by E. Elias Merhige, asks one of the most deliciously unhinged questions in movie history. What if Max Schreck, the actor who played Count Orlok in the original Nosferatu, was actually a real vampire? Willem Dafoe, in a performance that earned him an Oscar nomination and absolutely deserved it, plays Schreck as a genuine creature of the night, ancient, feral, and barely contained beneath the thin pretense of being an actor. John Malkovich plays director F.W. Murnau as a man so consumed by his artistic vision that he is willing to make genuinely monstrous bargains to achieve it. The film is wickedly funny in places, which makes it even more unsettling when the horror arrives, because it arrives hard. There is a scene where Schreck sits with the film crew around a campfire, and the casual, almost philosophical way he discusses feeding and mortality is one of the most chilling pieces of dialogue I have ever heard in a horror film. Shadow of the Vampire is smart, stylish, and operating on about 4 different levels simultaneously. It is a horror film, a dark comedy, a meditation on artistic obsession, and a genuinely loving tribute to the film that started the entire vampire genre. They're remarkable from start to finish. The Hunger, 1983. Coming in at number 17 is one of the most visually intoxicating vampire films ever made. Tony Scott's The Hunger is the kind of movie that grabs you by the collar in the first 5 minutes and never quite lets go. Opening with a jaw-dropping sequence set in a nightclub to the sound of Bauhaus performing Bela Lugosi's Dead, the film immediately announces itself as something operating in a completely different register from traditional horror. David Bowie plays John Blaylock, a centuries-old vampire whose immortality is beginning to unravel in a deeply cruel and horrifying way. Catherine Deneuve is Miriam, his companion, a vampire so ancient and so composed, she seems to have transcended ordinary human feeling entirely, and Susan Sarandon plays the scientist drawn into their world with mounting dread. The Hunger is less concerned with scaring you in conventional ways, and more interested in getting under your skin through atmosphere, sensuality, and an overwhelming sense of melancholy. The tragedy at its core, the idea of someone being promised forever and then discovering that promise has a devastating asterisk, is genuinely heartbreaking. Bowie's performance is extraordinary. He brings a fragility and a quiet devastation to the role that makes it impossible to look away. The film polarized critics on release, but has since been rightfully recognized as a visionary and deeply original piece of horror filmmaking. Byzantium, 2012. At number 16, we have a film that is criminally underseen, and I will keep saying that until more people watch it. Neil Jordan's Byzantium stars Gemma Arterton and Saoirse Ronan as Clara and Eleanor, a mother and daughter who have been surviving as vampires for over 2 centuries, constantly moving, constantly hiding, constantly running from a shadowy brotherhood that has deemed their existence an abomination. What Jordan does with this premise is extraordinary. He takes the mother-daughter relationship and places it under enormous, centuries-long pressure, examining how love transforms, how resentment builds, and how two people who share everything can still be living in completely different emotional worlds. Ronan is devastating as Eleanor, a vampire who has carried her guilt and her longing for ordinary human connection for 200 years and still has not found peace with what she is. Arterton is fierce and magnetic as Clara, a woman who has fought for survival so long that survival has become the only thing she knows. The film is set partly in a grimy British seaside town, and partly in flashbacks to the early 19th century, and both timelines are rendered with extraordinary care and atmosphere. Byzantium is a film about women, about power, about the stories we tell about ourselves, and about what it costs to endure. It is beautiful and brutal in equal measure. A Girl Walks Home, Alone at Night, 2014. Number 15 belongs to a film so singular, so original, and so deeply cool that I genuinely struggled to find the right words to describe it when I first saw it. Ayana Lily Emirpour's A Girl Walks Home, Alone at Night is an Iranian-American black and white vampire western. Yes, you read that correctly. Shot in gorgeous monochrome and set in a fictional Iranian ghost town called Bad City. The film follows a mysterious young woman, credited simply as the girl, played by Sheila Vand, who skateboards through empty streets at night wearing a chador that billows behind her like a cape and preys on men who exploit or harm the women around them. It is a feminist vampire film. It is a slow burn romance. It is a neo-noir. It is a music video come to life. It somehow manages to be all of these things at once without feeling overstuffed or incoherent. The atmosphere Amirpour creates is completely unlike anything else in vampire cinema. Every frame feels considered, deliberate, and dripping with mood. The film's iconic dance scene between the girl and the young man she is drawn to is one of the most quietly electric moments in recent cinema. This is the kind of thing that, once you see it, completely changes how you understood everything that came before it. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night is a masterpiece of independent filmmaking and an absolutely essential entry on this list. From Dusk Till Dawn, 1996. All right, we are shifting gears hard at number 14, and I love this transition because it perfectly illustrates the incredible range of the vampire genre. Robert Rodriguez's From Dusk Till Dawn is one of the most audaciously fun genre films ever made, and if you have somehow never seen it, I envy you the experience of watching it completely cold. The film begins as a gritty crime thriller written by a young Quentin Tarantino, who also stars alongside George Clooney as the Gecko Brothers, dangerous fugitives who kidnap a family and force them across the Mexican border. Then about halfway through, the film detonates its central surprise, and I refuse to spoil it for the uninitiated, except to say that the second half of this movie is an absolute wall-to-wall riot of practical effects, creature chaos, and gleefully over-the-top carnage set in a strip club that turns out to be something considerably more sinister than advertised. Clooney is magnetic in a way that reminds you exactly why he became a movie star. Salma Hayek delivers one of the most memorable entrances in horror movie history. And the film never once apologizes for being exactly what it is, which is a tremendous amount of fun, disguised as a crime movie, disguised as a vampire splatter fest. From dusk till dawn is the life of the party, every time. Salem's Lot, 1979. At number 13 is a television miniseries that terrified an entire generation and still holds up as one of the most effective vampire horror productions ever made. Tobe Hooper's Salem's Lot, based on Stephen King's novel, follows writer Ben Mears, who returns to the small Maine town of Jerusalem's Lot to write a book, only to find the town being quietly consumed by something ancient and ravenous. Hooper made a deliberate choice to ground the vampires in Salem's Lot in the classic Nosferatu tradition rather than the suave, romantic version, and the results are deeply unsettling. The design of the master vampire Barlow is genuinely terrifying. A pale, rat-faced, feral creature with glowing eyes that belongs to no comfortable category of horror. But what makes Salem's Lot genuinely brilliant is not just Barlow. It is the way Hooper and King use the vampire epidemic as a metaphor for the rot that can hide beneath the surface of small-town American life. The secrets, the petty cruelties, the quiet desperation that leaves communities vulnerable. The scene involving a child vampire floating outside a bedroom window, scratching at the glass, has haunted viewers for over 4 decades. I spent 3 hours going back through King's original notes on this story, and what I found shocked me. Hooper captured King's vision more faithfully than almost any other King adaptation, before or since. Near Dark, 1987. Number 12 is another film that sits in that glorious intersection between vampire horror and American genre cinema, and it does something genuinely remarkable with that combination. Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark follows Caleb, a young farm boy in rural Oklahoma who falls for a mysterious girl named May, only to discover she is part of a roaming pack of vampires drifting across the American Southwest in a blacked-out van. What Bigelow does with this premise is extraordinary. She never once uses the word vampire. She grounds every element of the mythology in gritty, sun-scorched American realism. So, the horror feels less like fantasy and more like something that could genuinely be lurking just off the interstate. The supporting cast, including Lance Henriksen, Bill Paxton, and Jeanette Goldstein, fresh off Aliens the year before, is absolutely ferocious. Paxton in particular delivers one of the most charismatically monstrous performances in horror history as the gleefully violent Severin, a vampire who genuinely loves what he is with every fiber of his being. The bar scene in Near Dark is one of the most tense, inventive, and viscerally disturbing sequences in 1980s horror. Near Dark bombed on release and has since been recognized as the masterwork it always was. The genre is full of films that arrive before their audience was ready for them. Near Dark is the poster child for that phenomenon. Only Lovers Left Alive, 2013. At number 11 is a film that takes the vampire genre and strips it down to its most philosophical, most elegiac, and most quietly devastating core. Jim Jarmusch's Only Lovers. Left Alive stars Tom Hiddleston and Tilda Swinton as Adam and Eve, 2 vampires who have been alive for centuries and are deeply, profoundly tired. Not in a melodramatic way, in a Tuesday afternoon way. Adam is a reclusive musician in Detroit, surrounded by vintage instruments and recording equipment, composing music that no one will hear. Eve is in Tangier, devouring books at a rate that only several centuries of reading practice makes possible. When Eve senses that Adam is sinking into a quiet despair, she flies across the world to be with him. And what unfolds is one of the most tender and unexpectedly moving love stories in recent cinema. Jarmusch is not interested in horror here. He is interested in the romance and the tragedy of immortality. What it does to curiosity, to creativity, to love, to your ability to care about a world you have watched make the same mistakes over and over again for 1,000 years. Hiddleston and Swinton have a chemistry that feels genuinely ancient and genuine, like two people who have loved each other long enough to have moved beyond the need to perform that love for anyone. Only Lovers Left Alive is hypnotic, melancholic, and utterly unique. Fright Night, 1985. We are in the top 10 now, and number 10 belongs to one of the most purely enjoyable vampire films ever made. Tom Holland's Fright Night is the kind of movie that reminds you exactly why you fell in love with cinema in the first place. It follows teenager Charlie Brewster, who becomes convinced that his new next-door neighbor, the charming and unnervingly handsome Jerry Dandridge, is a vampire. When no one believes him, Charlie turns to Peter Vincent, a washed-up horror movie host, played by the magnificent Roddy McDowall, for help. What follows is an enormously entertaining blend of horror, comedy, teen drama, and genuine old-school monster movie thrills that walks an almost impossibly fine tonal line without ever stumbling. Chris Sarandon as Jerry Dandridge is one of the great underappreciated vampire performances in cinema history. He is smooth, magnetic, genuinely threatening, and occasionally very funny, sometimes within the same sentence. The film has tremendous affection for classic vampire lore, while simultaneously having a great deal of fun with its 80s setting and sensibility. Fright Night understands that horror and humor are not opposites. They are neighbors. They share a fence, and the best genre films know how to lean over that fence and borrow from both yards whenever the story demands it. This film is pure, joyful, crafted entertainment from beginning to end. What We Do in the Shadows, 2014. At number 9 is a film that made me laugh so hard the first time I watched it that I had to pause it repeatedly just to collect myself. Taika Waititi and Jermaine Clement's What We Do in the Shadows is a mockumentary following 4 vampire flatmates in Wellington, New Zealand, as they navigate the profound indignities of modern life while being several centuries old. There is Viago, an enthusiastic and slightly tragic romantic. There is Vladislav, a former Dark Lord with unfortunate history involving a nemesis called the Beast. There is Deacon, the youngest at a mere 183 years old and therefore responsible for the flat's chores, a responsibility he resents deeply. And then there is Peter, who is 8,000 years old, lives in a stone coffin in the basement, and bears a striking resemblance to Count Orlok from Nosferatu. I went down such a deep rabbit hole researching the making of this film that my wife had to physically take my laptop away from me at midnight. Waititi and Clement largely improvised around a loose framework, and the result is a film so densely packed with jokes, ideas, and genuine vampire mythology that it reveals new layers on every single rewatch. What makes it genuinely great beyond just being hilarious is the unexpected emotional core. These are lonely, ancient creatures who just want connection and belonging, and that is funny and quietly heartbreaking in equal measure. 30 Days of Night, 2007. Number 8 takes us to Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost town in America, where the sun sets in November and does not rise again for 30 days. David Slade's 30 Days of Night takes that geographical fact and turns it into one of the most terrifyingly clever vampire premises in the genre's history. When a group of ancient feral vampires descends on Barrow at the start of the long polar night, the town's sheriff, played by Josh Hartnett, must find a way to keep the remaining survivors alive for an entire month of unbroken darkness. These are not charming, seductive, romanticized vampires. They are hunters. They communicate in a guttural, inhuman language. They move in packs with ruthless tactical intelligence. They do not negotiate, and they do not tire. Slade shoots the film with a color palette of deep blacks and blood reds that makes every frame feel like a painting of the end of the world. The aerial shot showing the creatures moving through the snow-covered town, hunting in coordinated patterns, is one of the most genuinely disturbing images in modern horror cinema. 30 Days of Night is relentless, brutal, and utterly committed to its premise. It asks a simple question. What would you do if the monsters had a full month to find you? And answers it with one of the most gripping survival horror films of the 2000s. Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992. At number 7, we have a film that remains 30 years on, the most visually audacious and operatically romantic vampire movie ever made. Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula is a film of breathtaking excess, and it is absolutely magnificent. Gary Oldman plays the Count across multiple forms, as the ancient shriveled warrior in his castle, as the wolf-like predator prowling London's fog-drenched streets, and as the young, dark, hypnotically beautiful prince who captivates Mina Murray. Winona Ryder plays Mina with genuine emotional complexity, and Anthony Hopkins arrives as Van Helsing with the kind of theatrical enormity that the role has always deserved. Coppola made the deliberate decision to shoot the film using in-camera effects, shadow puppetry, hand-painted backdrops, and optical illusions rather than the digital effects that were available to him. The result is a film that feels genuinely handcrafted, theatrical, and alive in a way that most modern blockbusters simply do not. Every frame looks like it was designed by a painter in the grip of some exquisite derangement. The film is also more faithful to Stoker's original novel than almost any previous adaptation, restoring the story's preoccupation with desire, transgression, and the terror of female sexuality that Victorian society spent so much energy trying to suppress. It is a grand, gorgeous, slightly mad piece of cinema. The Lost Boys, 1987. Number 6 is the film that arguably defined vampire cinema for an entire generation. And if you grew up in the 1980s, just the mention of the title probably just put the saxophone solo from that opening scene directly into your head. Joel Schumacher's The Lost Boys follows brothers Michael and Sam, who move with their mother to the California beach town of Santa Carla, a place whose reputation for weirdness is announced by a sign in the very first scene. When Michael falls for the mysterious star and gets drawn into the orbit of a gang of leather-jacketed, motorcycle-riding, supremely cool young vampires led by the magnetic Kiefer Sutherland, Sam turns to the Frog Brothers and self-proclaimed vampire hunters who work in a comic book store for help. The Lost Boys is a film of tremendous style, infectious energy, and genuine horror wrapped in a package so effortlessly 80s that it should technically have an expiry date, and yet, somehow it absolutely does not. Kiefer Sutherland has never been cooler than he is here, which is saying something. The film's genius lies in understanding that vampirism is the perfect metaphor for the seduction of rebellion. The gang offers Michael freedom, belonging, excitement, and a life without consequences, and the fact that it also offers an eternity of violence is almost beside the point. Blade, 1998. At number 5 is the film that proved superhero cinema could work on a large scale before anyone was really paying attention to that fact, and simultaneously delivered one of the greatest vampire action films ever committed to screen. Though, Stephen Norrington's Blade, starring Wesley Snipes in what remains perhaps the single most physically committed and charismatically cool performance in the entire Marvel canon, follows the Daywalker, a half-human, half-vampire warrior with all of the strengths of the vampire and none of the weaknesses, as he wages a one-man war against the vampire underworld of modern America. The opening sequence of this film, set in a vampire nightclub where the sprinkler system runs on blood, remains one of the most audacious, confident, and downright spectacular action sequences of the 1990s. Norrington and Snipes essentially invented a new visual grammar for urban action cinema that dozens of films spent the next decade trying to copy. Stephen Dorff is a genuinely compelling villain as Deacon Frost, a vampire who lacks the aristocratic breeding of the old guard and compensates with pure ambition and charisma. But the film belongs entirely to Snipes, who plays Blade with a focused intensity and physical authority that never for a single moment lets you doubt that this man could actually do the things you are watching him do. Blade is cool, capitalized, underlined, forever. Nosferatu, 1922. Number 4 is where we arrive at something that transcends the category of vampire movie and enters the territory of genuine cultural artifact. FWW, Murnau's Nosferatu, released in 1922, is not just the first vampire film in cinema history. It is the film that gave the vampire its visual identity, its iconography, and much of its enduring mythology. Count Orlok, played by Max Schreck in a performance of such genuine physical strangeness that people speculated for decades about how it was achieved, is the shadow from which every vampire that followed was cast. Tall, skeletal, with elongated fingers, pointed ears, and eyes that seem to catch light that no one else in the frame can see. Orlok is not seductive. He is not romantic. He is pestilence given human shape, a walking plague, and the film's most inspired stroke is connecting the vampire to the arrival of the actual plague, making the metaphor literal in the most devastating way. Murnau shot the film on real locations in Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic coast, and the natural settings give Nosferatu a documentary quality that makes its supernatural elements feel startlingly plausible. The shadow of Orlok climbing a staircase, his silhouette rising rigid from his coffin, his finger pointing an accusation across a sunlit courtyard. These are images that have lived in the collective unconscious of cinema for over a century. Nosferatu is not just essential viewing, it is the foundation. Let the Right One. That behind a word, this 2008. At number 3 is a film that I will go to my grave, arguing is one of the greatest films ever made. Full stop. No genre qualifier required. Thomas Alfredson's Let the Right One In is a Swedish vampire film adapted from John Ajvide Lindqvist's extraordinary novel, and it is a film of such quiet devastation, such precise emotional intelligence, and such profound sadness that it genuinely changed the way I thought about what horror movies could do. The film follows Oscar, a lonely, bullied 12-year-old boy living in a suburb of Stockholm in the early 1980s, who befriends his new neighbor Eli, a child who has been 12 years old for a very, very long time. Their relationship, fragile and tender, and desperately needed by both of them, forms the emotional core of the film. Alfredson is extraordinarily careful about how he reveals information, trusting his audience to sit with uncertainty and ambiguity rather than rushing to explain or resolve. The horror in Let the Right One In is never cheap. Every violent moment lands with genuine weight because the film has made you care so deeply about these characters that consequences feel real. The pool scene that closed the film is one of the most perfectly constructed sequences in cinema history. Shocking, beautiful, and emotionally conclusive in a way that leaves you unable to speak for several minutes afterward. Honestly, this film is what made me fall in love with the horror genre in the first place. Interview with the Vampire, 1994. At number 2 is a film that arrived at exactly the right cultural moment, with exactly the right cast, and delivered exactly what the source material demanded, which is no small feat given how beloved Anne Rice's novel was to its enormous readership. Neil Jordan's interview with the vampire stars Tom Cruise as the seductive and absolutely terrifying Lestat de Liancourt, and Brad Pitt as Louis, the vampire who cannot reconcile his humanity with his monstrous nature, and their dynamic is the film's extraordinary engine. The tension between Lestat, who embraces what he is with a kind of delirious, almost evangelical joy, and Louis, who mourns every life he takes and cannot stop taking them, is one of the great philosophical conflicts in horror cinema. Kirsten Dunst, at the age of 11, delivers a performance as the child vampire Claudia that should by any rights have been impossible for an actor of that age, yet she is absolutely equal to both Cruise and Pitt in every scene she shares with them. Jordan adapts Rice's lush, gothic, deeply romantic prose with genuine fidelity, creating a film that looks and sounds and feels like a 19th century painting come to horrifying life. This is a vampire film that treats its subject matter with complete seriousness and finds in that seriousness something genuinely grand. The ending, and what Lestat does in that final scene, still makes me want to applaud every single time. Dracula, 1931. And in first place is the film that started everything. Todd Browning's Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi in the role that defined the vampire for an entire century of popular culture, is the foundation upon which every film on this list was built. And I want to be clear about something, because I think it deserves to be said plainly. Lugosi's performance is not just historically significant. It is genuinely extraordinary. There is a scene early in the film where Dracula stands at the top of his crumbling staircase and greets his guests with a measured, almost courtly grace. And the combination of Lugosi's physical presence, his stillness, the way he deploys that accent as a weapon, and the absolute certainty in his eyes that he is the most dangerous thing in any room he enters. It is one of the great star-making moments in Hollywood history. Browning creates an atmosphere of gothic dread from almost nothing. Minimal sets, minimal score, minimal special effects, relying almost entirely on light, shadow, composition, and the irreplaceable charisma of his leading man. The film is the reason we associate black capes with vampires. It is the reason Transylvania means something to the Western imagination. It is the reason every actor who has played Dracula since has had to reckon with one specific performance. Lugosi did not just play Dracula. He became him. And this film, lean and strange, and nearly 100 years old, still carries that electricity. It always will, and there you have it. The 20 greatest vampire movies of all time. From the silent shadows of 1922 to the sun-drenched suburbs and blood-soaked dance floors of the modern era, the vampire has proven itself to be the most enduring and most versatile monster in cinema history. Whether you came to this list for the scares, the style, the romance, or the philosophy, I hope you found something here that made you want to hit play tonight. If you enjoyed this countdown, give the video a thumbs up. It genuinely helps more film lovers find this channel. Subscribe to Top Movies so you never miss a list, and drop your favorite vampire film in the comments below. I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.